Good afternoon if you're on the East Coast, or good early evening if you're here from London. This is indeed a global conversation. I'm Margaret Miller. I'm the director of the Institute for Research in Art at the University of South Florida in Tampa. That's on the west coast of Florida. And I'm director of 3 programs that have a wonderful synergy that allow us to do projects like this one. The Institute for Research in Art is the umbrella for the Contemporary Art Museum, Graphic Studio, and Public Art. Life During Wartime, Art in the Age of the Coronavirus was curated, or is being curated by Christian Viveros-Fauné, our Curator-at-large. When the pandemic began and the university was shut down, we had to quickly pivot and think of a way to continue our programming and our mission. And we asked Christian to come up with an idea for a virtual exhibition, and indeed he has. So we're very excited. The exhibition has been launched. This is the second conversation with Jake Chapman today. And the exhibition will continue to grow with new artists being added through December 12th. And you can go to lifeduringwartimeexhibition.org and continue to learn about the new artists that are being added weekly. I want to say something about the importance of having a really experienced curator. We always talk about elevating the voices of artists and our commitment to programming that addresses social justice. And certainly we have a history of doing that, and we want to do more and learn more and figure out new ways of presenting artists that are working today. And so this was really essential, and I think that the voice of Christian Viveros-Fauné is really valued in terms of his network, his knowledge of artists, and bringing them together so powerfully for this exhibition. I want to now introduce you to Noel Smith, and Noel is the Deputy Director of the Contemporary Art Museum, and she will introduce Christian a little more formally. So enjoy this intimate conversation. It's really the silver lining in this shutdown of museums and the ability to experience objects physically. So this is a moment of an opportunity to really hear from leading artists in their studios. So Noel Smith, welcome.
Thank you, Margaret. Thank you all for being here today with us for this talk. First, I'd like to recognize the efforts of the entire Contemporary Art Museum team in putting together this exhibition. From Director Margaret Miller, Curator Christian Viveros-Fauné, and then a number of our wonderful, wonderful staff, including Don Fuller, Mark Fredericks, exhibitions manager Shannon Annis, and virtually every member of the team who have been singularly focused over the past 2 months in putting together this exhibition. I'd also like to recognize the Andy Warhol Foundation for the Visual Arts and the Florida Department of State for their support of our programming. So the program today is as follows. First, I will introduce our curator, Christian Viveros-Fauné. After his address, he will introduce artist Jake Chapman. And at the end of their conversation, we will open up for questions from you, our viewers. We will accept questions in written form. And if you are watching from Zoom, please use the Q&A button on the lower right end of the screen. And if you're watching on Facebook, please leave questions in the comment field. Please keep them brief and to the point. Please be aware that we're not going to be able to answer them all, but we'll do the best we can. So thanks for your understanding and patience. And now it's my honor and privilege to introduce to you the curator of Life During Wartime, the USF Contemporary Art Museum's Curator-at-large, Christian Viveros-Fauné. Christian Viveros-Fauné, born in Santiago, Chile in 1965, has worked as a gallerist, art fair director, art critic, and curator since 1994. He was awarded a USF Kennedy Visiting Family Fellowship in 2018, a Creative Capital Warhol Foundation grant for short-form arts writing in 2009, was named art critic in residence at the Bronx Museum in 2011, and has lectured at Yale University, Pratt Institute, and Amsterdam's Gerrit Rietveld Academy. Viveros-Fauné is chief critic for Artland and writes regularly for Art Review and Sotheby's Art Agency's Partners, in other words. He serves as Curator-at-large at the University of South Florida Contemporary Art Museum and has curated numerous museum exhibitions around the world, and is also the author of several books, the most recent being Social Forms, A Short History of Political Art, published by David Zwirner Books in 2018. Welcome, Christian.
Thank you, Noel. Thank you, everyone, for being here in the remote version in which you're here. I'd like to welcome you to USFCAM's first virtual exhibition, Life During Wartime, Art in the Age of Coronavirus. As you think you know, this show is an experiment. It's an experiment in how to present, promote, foment, talk about, exchange, and do culture virtually. Now, when I say virtually, I don't mean the same thing that we might have meant maybe 3 or 4 months ago when we said virtually. The word virtual, until recently, had 2 basic components. It meant digital and it meant simulacra. Well, what we're doing here and other institutions around the world are doing is, unfortunately, no longer a simulacra. It is the real thing. This is the way we are trading in culture, in visual culture, in our case specifically. It is our reality, like it or not. There's a silver lining there, as I think Margaret mentioned. Maybe we talk about slightly more serious things. Maybe we pay a little less attention to the socializing. In every crisis, there's an opportunity, and perhaps there's an opportunity for us here. The point is that this is our take it or leave it reality at present. And right now, there's no other way to do culture safely and responsibly, no matter what certain governors of the United States tell you. I'd like to start out by giving you an overview of the show that's on the platform that we're all on now, Life During Wartime. This show humbly, and I say humbly because I think we all need to acknowledge the incompleteness of our particular points of view and potential blind spots these days, engages a select company of international artists. We've got about 50 at present. We'll probably grow to 60 before the show is over. The idea is that we want them, or rather we want to follow them as they respond to the overwhelming realities of the crisis that's gripped the planet since March 5, the date the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 a global pandemic. The exhibition takes full advantage of one of the few outlets artists still have, the internet, during a public health emergency recently exacerbated by the wanton murder of George Floyd by police officers in Minneapolis. It aims to mobilize sentiment, thought, and activity around art and its enduring possibilities, its role as a conceptual catalyst, its ability to trigger ideas, stories, conversations, emotions, feelings, and mental states. Separately and together, each artist's contribution provides a picture of a planet in crisis, now further victimized and enraged by violence, but also images of hope and optimism in the face of a global emergency. A couple of additional words about the show itself. The show exists presently, at least, entirely online. Duh, right? Well, we hope to be able to physically host some version of Life During Wartime. Again, the only safe way to make shows in the era of COVID-19 is to do so virtually. That is to say, not physically, without objects that you can walk around and appreciate, but with images and the awful power and the sometimes powerful distortions that these entail, that these create. We'll maybe talk about that a little bit more later. Secondly, I want to point out that the exhibition will unspool over time so that the 10 contributions that you have access to right now will expand and continue to evolve in the months to come. From our opening on June 6th, a few weeks ago, until the closing of the show on 12 December. Really, by the time the end of October rolls around, what we'll have is all the artist contributions up on the website, up on the dedicated platform for you to enjoy. The idea behind this evolving exhibition strategy is in part to avoid the unwanted experience of a virtual data dump, right? We just basically dump everything on the site at once, and you come and you look at it once, or you never come back again. We don't want that. What we want you guys to do, what we want you audience members to do, is to possibly create sustained engagement. Come back again, come back and see us, come back and see the new contributions, talk to the artists. As we, again, also sort of unspool a program that will kick in basically conversations like the one we're gonna have with Jake Chapman today, every couple of weeks. That's the idea. Again, this is an experiment in every possible way. You're experimenting now in listening to us. I say that in part because I also want you to bear with us to the degree that in experimenting, we put a foot wrong, which we will undoubtedly do, because hopefully we will put a foot right. For example, my neighbor now who won't turn his car alarm off. To explain the exhibition further, let me rewind a little to June 6th. To kick off our live Zoom opening on June the 6th, we unveiled 6 specific artist contributions. These were artworks and text by Basil Kincaid, Christina Lucas, Narciso Martinez, Nusha Tabakolian, Spencer Tunick, and of course, Jake and Dinos Chapman. Jake's with us today. That's one American, one Spaniard is in Madrid, one Mexican-American is in Los Angeles, one New Yorker, one Iranian who's in Tehran, and for Jake, who is with us here from Beaufort, England. Apparently that's very close to Oxford. I've never visited Beaufort. This week, we've unveiled 4 more artist contributions. These exist basically as images, videos, critical writings, and personal statements by these artists: Ellen Harvey, Deb Cass, Dagoberto Rodriguez, and William Villalongo. These artworks are now up on the site for Life During Wartime. As Margaret mentioned, lifeduringwartimeexhibition.org. You can always go there, right, for all the information, all the updates. But I encourage you to peruse and enjoy, even while we're talking now, right? Get a sense of what the exhibition looks like. I really want to encourage you to do that while we talk, but you know, also possibly in lieu of like vegetating at home, pondering the uselessness of watching yet another cooking competition on the Food Channel. Maybe I gave away a little something about what I do when I'm not working there. But before I go any further, before I introduce Jake, I'd like to ask our webmaster to pull up a few images and materials from 3 of the 4 artists whose work we unveiled this week. I want to talk about them a little bit. They are, as I mentioned, Ellen Harvey, Deb Cass, William Villalongo. Don, we now have Ellen Harvey's page up. For those of you that don't know Ellen yet, Ellen Harvey is a UK-born conceptual artist who lives and works in Brooklyn. Her paintings, installation, multimedia works, and projects have always experimented with the idea of collections, exhibition formats, and new modes of looking. Her newest project, which you're looking at one of the images in that project here, is called The Disappointed Tourist. I want you to consider the myriad resonances of that title while we look at this and 2 other images of hers. That project does all the things I mentioned, but in spades. What she essentially did was crowdsourced via the web a number of suggestions for sites, physical sites that once existed and obviously no longer exist. And she made paintings of them. The question she asked that people responded to was, is there a place that you would like to visit or revisit that doesn't exist anymore? Ellen's paintings of lost physical sites around the world were really an exploration of nostalgia, an attempt to create conversations across different types of loss. This is the way she's put it. She tended to paint a range from, as she's in her own words, from the intensely personal to larger cultural losses, from childhood memories to places of trauma, from victims of gentrification and technological change to places ravaged by climate change and war, from recent losses to the fabulous lost sites of antiquity. Now, she had a show that was scheduled. This project was going to Tate Contemporary in Margate. Of course, that got shut down along with the rest of the world, and so she was left with her boxes or crates in her studio to ponder what was next. And part of what was next, unfortunately, in her case, was one, contracting COVID-19, and two, in the midst of having contracted that illness, continuing to work on the series. And so the series is expanded. Ellen realized something really basic while she was working, and that was that a lot of the crowdsourced sites that she painted were fundamentally social sites, right? There were cinemas, amusement parks, bars, religious institutions, etc. The pandemic, of course, put a stop to these places being social in any way. I mean, I know they were social in memory, but to the idea of them being revisited, right? As she put it, none of us can go anywhere right now. We're all disappointed tourists now. I mean, that's one way in which her work, along with the work of a number of people who've blessed us with their artworks, have changed, right? The works have changed. They've been recontextualized, often resignified. This is one case. This image in particular is the Temple of Bel. It's an acrylic on gesso board painting done largely in grays, black, and white, and a bit of blue, as you can see. It was painted this year. I'm not exactly sure when, but I'm guessing somewhere around the beginning of January when Ellen's on. She'll hopefully talk about this painting and others. A few of us know that Bel or Baal was a temple dedicated to the Mesopotamian god in Baal in AD 32. A few of us who are attentive to CNN and the 24/7 news feed may remember that it was the best preserved ancient structure in Palmyra, Syria, before it was basically blown to smithereens by the Islamic State in 2015. The second image, which I want to go to here, is a full color painting called Monument for Mrs. V. This is from 2020, but evidently later. It's painted sort of after the Vienna Pestau or plague column, an actual column that's right smack in the middle of Vienna that commemorates the death of about 70,000 people from the Black Plague in that city. Ellen's use of this image is, frankly, heartbreaking. I'll let her tell the story in her own words, which again, you can find on the site. This painted monument, she writes, is dedicated to Sandra Santos Vizcaíno, who died on March 31 of COVID-19. She was the first public school teacher in New York City to die of the virus. She was survived by a son, a daughter, and her husband. She was only 54. I knew her when she was my son's beloved second grade teacher at PS 89. Mrs. V, as she was known, was a force of nature. She loved poetry. She was a religious woman, and I hope she would like this painting of the plague column in Vienna. It has a kind of warmth and drama that reminds me of her. The last image of Ellen's that I want to show you is her very recent painting of what was once called Black Wall Street. Black Wall Street was the name given to the Greenwood district of Tulsa, Oklahoma, one of the most successful and majority Black communities of the time. It was destroyed on May 31 and June 1 of 1921 by a white mob that had originally assembled to lynch Dick Rowland, a Black teenager who was being held in the jail on suspicion of assaulting Sarah Page, a white woman. When armed black residents arrived to support the sheriff, shots were fired. What was eventually called the Tulsa Race Riot, the Black Wall Street Massacre, or the Greenwood Massacre included machine gun and aerial attacks on the black community, resulting in the loss of almost 200 businesses, a school, several churches, and over 1,000 homes. The total loss of black lives is disputed, with estimates ranging between 55 and 300. There is a clear consensus that there were 13 white casualties. According to the Red Cross, some 10,000 people were left homeless. Despite the indictment of 85 people, no one was convicted for any of the deaths, injuries, or property damage. Victims received no compensation. The incident has been called the worst single incident of racial violence in America. But until recently, it was almost entirely written out of the history books. In 1996, the state legislature authorized the Tulsa Race Massacre Commission to create a historical account of the event. This led to the creation of a memorial park and scholarships for some of the descendants. It did not, alas, lead to the payment of reparations as recommended by the commissions. I want to move on to see a few works by Deb Cass. The first image I want us to look at is Deb's painting, Isn't It Rich? Besides being celebrated for her revisitations of American pop paintings and her monumental Oi Yo sculptures, some of you may have seen images of that sculpture on the news last week. There were Black Lives Matter demonstrations that basically sort of engulfed the sculpture outside of the Brooklyn Museum in New York. But Deb's work examines many of the expectations we sort of unthinkingly retain for contemporary art, right? One of her best known series of paintings is what we have on the site. They are called Feel Good Paintings for Feel Bad Times. They're a set of canvases that use language and the sanctioned stylings of celebrated male artists to express key cultural conflicts. And they obviously marshal, as you can see, wit and graphic punch to force confrontations between the canonical, say the orthodoxies established by male artists, for instance, and the disruptive, their appropriation by a female artist, particularly female artists with a very sharp sense of humor. The results, as you can see here, are demystifying, cutting, even hilarious. Times being funny is really just saying what's true. This particular painting, which is oil and acrylic on canvas, appears to combine, say, the color stripes of Barnett Newman or Ellsworth Kelly with the lyrics of Stephen Sondheim, pardon me. Some of you may recall the phrase, "Isn't it rich?" It's the first lyric of the song Send in the Clowns, which I've always thought is a side-splittingly funny song. This next painting, go to the next one, Cojones, which was the first one we saw. Again, appropriates Jasper John's sort of signature gridded grisile setup, right? And it's titled Painting with Balls, right? This is what this painting is titled. Some of you may be able to read at the bottom there some of the material and the titles of the works. But that's kind of what cojones are, right? I mean, they're sort of things as stupidly self-evident as beer cans or flags or tennis balls, which in several instances Jasper Johns used to insert into paintings, and also made a number of prints from this sort of basic idea. The last image of Deb's I want to show you is pretty self-explanatory. We actually went through, we asked every single one of the artists who's participating in the show to give us some kind of statement or quote about either the work or the specific work that we were putting up on the site, or better yet, their experience basically sort of during the quarantine. Deb cut straight to the case and gave us this image as her statement. And was originally made for, it's obviously a billboard, but it was originally made for For Freedoms, FOR Freedoms, which is an artist-led platform for political awareness started by the artists Hank Willis Thomas and Eric Gottesman in 2016. Now, before we get to talking to Jake, I want to look at a couple of images from Will Villalongo. Will be on with us next week, 25 June, Thursday, with Mark Thomas Gibson, whose work we're actually putting up next week. And they are, how should I say, friends of the restaurant, friends of the museum. Before my tenure at the museum, actually, they participated in the show of their own work, and they curated a show called Black Pulp, which was apparently, well, not apparently terrific. It was terrific. I've seen the material, but unfortunately I couldn't experience it myself. I only came into the museum in 2018. But we're really excited to have them both on next week. And sort of as a teaser to that, I wanted to show you some of these images. This first image is, well, let me just say that most of William's work often involves cutting. It's cutting of the sort of like flurries of paper and acrylic cutouts that generally taken together sort of cohere into images of Black bodies, which again, you know, as I think we know, are one of the most contested sort of images that we have, right? That we have in the history of art. In this case, he's made this work, which is from 2015, entitled "We Can't Breathe," from 13 separate framed silk screens of coloring book pages that describe the human respiratory system. I'm not sure if we can get any closer than this now, but I think when you look at it on the platform, you will see that the background is essentially drawings, diagrams of the human respiratory system. And on that, what William has done is put atop the dying words of Eric Gardner, who, for those that don't know, was a Black American killed by New York police officer Daniel Pantaleo in Staten Island in 2014. The last image I want to look at is "Free Black and All American." Don, if you can go to that. This work is from 2017. Again, I want to stress that, well, let me explain that I think about half of the work in the exhibition was made before the pandemic, and about half of the work has essentially been made during the quarantine. Why do I mention this? I mention this because, again, I think it's important to realize that in the same way that ancient work that we're going to talk about with Jake, pre-modern work, or work that's right at the cusp of modernity, specifically Goya's The Disasters of War, get recontextualized, unfortunately, every so often, and they often get resignified. And that is the case with this work from 2017, "Free Black and All American" of William Villalongo's. The patch of black velour that's sort of held up by the two hands in the artwork signal the percentage of the American population that is Black. That statistic, among other things, sort of invites us to consider other sort of American statistics, among them the fact that Black Americans account for 40% of America's prison population, which means, of course, continuing with the statistics, that 1 in 3 Black men are likely to spend time in prison in their lifetime, as opposed to, say, 1 in 17 white men. We can continue to spin out these statistics all day, unfortunately, because these are statistics and proofs at issues that we have not clearly sort of come to terms with in this country. But I think we'll leave that for another day and bring on Jake, who's been waiting patiently in what I think is his library. Jake, let's have you appear. Abracadabra while I introduce you.
Hi.
Hey, Jake. While we're doing that, Don, can we go to the row of images that I mentioned to you of Jake and Dinos? So, Jake, I think you still need to hit your camera.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
No, you're good. You're good. You're good.
Am I good?
Look,
Am I
yeah,
on?
you're good. I think.
Okay.
Well, I don't see your image, big guy.
Okay. Hang on. I'll try
Hit your
again.
video. We can hear you.
Just stop video. Start video. Is that good?
No, you look blacker than usual. I mean, in terms of your humor.
Hang on. Hang on. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
I can hear you perfectly.
Right. Okay. So, is that any good?
The sound is perfect, man, but we can't see you.
Oh, that's really strange. I mean, I'm pressing the start video button, and it's not doing anything. No.
Well, look, don't worry about it. Listen, keep toying with it if you can.
Yeah, sure.
And it's, look, it's a charm to just have you on, man. So if it's Jake Chapman, there you go.
Oh, okay.
Now we got it. But it's black again now.
Okay.
No, you were on a sec. There you go. Now you're on.
Here I am. Okay.
Thank you,
Sorry,
man. All right.
I'm completely inept at this.
No, you're not.
Obviously.
You're grand. and just hang with me because I'm gonna read your intro, which is one of the most sort of bizarre things I've had to do because obviously I think everyone knows exactly who you bloody are. So look, I'm again in the unenviable position of trying to talk about an artist who I not only admire but who I'm bound to fall short in introducing. So Jake is one half of the famous artist duo Jake and Dinos Chapman. Besides being among Britain's best-known artists, the Chapmans have created a unique oeuvre that draws in vast areas of culture, including art history, philosophy, cybernetics, and artificial intelligence. The brothers started the collaboration in 1991 and have since been known for their deliberately shocking and controversial subject matter. They make iconoclastic sculpture, prints, and installations that examine with searing wit and energy contemporary politics, religion, and morality. Their works are reminiscent of both Hieronymus Bosch's Scenes of Hell and Francisco Goya's dark parodies of Spanish history. Their work has been shown in too many major museums for me to mention, so I'm going to quit right now. I'm going to quit trying. Welcome, Jake. It's an absolute pleasure to have you here today.
Thank you so much. I'm very flattered to be invited.
Oh, please, man. Look, man, you've made a lot of art intended to shock delicate sensibilities. One of your first pieces, We Are Artists from 1992, was an anti-aesthetic manifesto you stenciled onto a mud-splattered wall at the ICA in London. In 1994, you gave child mannequins genitalia for faces. Fuckface was the title of that piece, if I remember correctly, of that series.
Yep.
In 2008, you doctored, or improved, I believe was the term you used, genuine Adolf Hitler watercolors by painting their backgrounds with rainbows, smiley faces, floating hearts, and psychedelic skies. I will mention the title, If Hitler Had Been a Hippie Now, How Happy We Would Be. I can't agree more with that sentiment. But since 1993, when you constructed three-dimensional tableau inspired by Francisco de Goya's etchings, The Disasters of War, you've used Goya as an inspirational go-to, as a point of artistic reference. As we look over the terrific and hilarious new suite of works you presented us with here, which you titled, wait for it now, there's a drum roll, The Disasters of Yoga, let me ask you the obvious question. What gives with Goya? Why is he an artist you come back to again and again?
Well, I think you already alluded to that in your mention of Goya as being, I think you started as saying pre-modern, and then you said actually, almost the first emergent modern artist in a sense. So I think at the moment when Dinos and I were considering the notion of working together, which in itself entailed a consideration of what collaboration versus the individual artist meant. We were kind of prompted to think about what the first modern artist, what that meant, what that was, how that happened. And I suppose in order to kind of furnish our collaboration with some kind of genealogical meaning, we decided to, I guess, take Goya hostage as being the person, I kind of almost like returning to the scene of the crime, as it were, you know, to kind of return to Goya and incriminate him with the responsibility of being the first modern artist, the first artist who, you know, kind of is severed from the church, you know, from the function of iconographic representation of religious icons. He's the first artist, you know, putatively to present to a public the notion of what it is for an artist to have an internal psyche, you know. So he's the first artist that you can properly psychoanalyze in terms of the fact that it's a kind of that the work is a kind of an exploration into self-doubt and internal torment. And, you know, I guess that in a sense for us was a good place to start, you know, in terms of all of our inquiries and our examinations and challenges to the idea of what modernity means, you know. And I guess also the idea that he also is an artist who emerges from or is very effectively influenced by the beginning of the Enlightenment.
Correct.
You know, yeah. So.
Yeah, he's also sort of the first artist to really sort of do work, as it were, sort of on spec. That is, he does it because he's inspired to do it. There aren't all commissions, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you look at the portrait paintings, I mean, it's you can see that the notion of patronage there, it kind of only exists within the faciality of the paintings, where obviously he's been paid to perform some kind of likeness. And if you look at the way that the strokes around the rest of the paintings, they kind of look like abstract expressionist paintings. It's so you can see that somehow what he's doing is he's kind of dividing his time between what he has to do and what he wants to do.
What he wants to do, yeah. Some of the paintings look a little like almost hack-handed, depending on
absolutely
who the patron is, how important the patron is.
Yeah.
But also specifically with the disasters of war, I mean, you know, I think it's important to tell everyone who doesn't know that not only were these prints wildly unsuccessful, they actually weren't published in his lifetime. Yep. They were published 35 years after his death. He put 10 years of work into these things from 1810 to 1820, you know, and got very little personal satisfaction out of them, aside from the making of them. You know, yes. there's no triumphal, there's no big show after, there's no big Tate retrospective after this.
Well, I think that kind of typifies what's interesting about them, because I guess, you know, after their eventual sort of accommodation into the canon of art, that actually the way they've been absorbed or recuperated is as the most sort of morally pertinent work in terms of their depiction of atrocity and the usual kind of an almost very glib statement that kind of accompanies them often, you know, is they're institutionally framed by a kind of morality that actually the execution of the work doesn't really exhibit, which I guess is, you know, this notion that they depict man's inhumanity as man. That one of the reasons that they were not successful in a kind of a literal way is because in fact the kind of undecidability of the work, even in terms of being able to tell who's Napoleonic and who's Spanish, you know, the idea of the kind of the mess of them, the chaos and almost the kind of libidinized forms of violence occurring in their absolute molecular detail, makes it very difficult for them to offer themselves as just mere propaganda. And I think it's only after a period of years that have they been sort of somehow accommodated into a very unagile humanist sort of reading, which requires them to have some kind of moral fixative, to be morally fixed, as it were.
Are you suggesting they're not pro-Enlightenment propaganda? Is that what you're suggesting?
I'm suggesting that if they, you know, obviously there's pro-Enlightenment and propaganda, but they're entirely enlightened in terms of the fact that the element of enlightened sort of discourse that they offer is just a sense of complete catastrophic self-doubt. You know, in a sense, there's something very heretical about them, given their time. That really what's being kind of traded off is the notion of redemption against the idea of gravity. And I think the best example of that is, I think it's print number 39, Great Deeds Against the Dead, which pictures 3 figures hanging from a tree. And what's kind of astonishing about this is the idea of saying that, you know, that there's no redemption given to these figures, that these figures will sag into the soil. Actually, what they're prone to is the physics of gravity rather than divine redemption, and that in itself is kind of hugely radical.
Yeah, no, they're certainly sort of equal opportunity offenders. There are no heroes in this particular set of suite of prints, right? Yeah. You know, the people are just as barbarous as the French hussars, and you know, el populacho is what he called them, the rabble. In many. Let's stay here for a second, because I actually want to talk to this, and I believe this is print 37, which right. I'm actually can we? What does it say? Right. This is worse, is what it says. Yeah. Esto es peor. And what you've done, actually, you tell us what you've done.
It's even worse. Well,
okay.
I mean, I guess that, you know, there's a certain provocation in the work, and the provocation is, I guess, like the drawing on the Hitler works, is a kind of a finely tuned way of inciting a kind of moral defense for work which doesn't really require it. I mean, I guess Hitler is a different case, in fact, actually. But with the Goya work, it's that the work is so now thoroughly in exchange. It's interchangeable for the morality which now completely institutionally sort of shrouds the work. But that it takes an extreme effort, like putting banal images of yoga gurus to actually maybe kind of, you know, recontextualize the work, you know, to kind of, you know, I mean, I think that already sounds too worthy, and I probably shouldn't have said that.
No. Well, I mean, look, I mean, I think the banality that you mentioned, you know, there is a banal reading of these pieces, a banal reading of Goya, is a banal reading of everything, right? And unfortunately, the man's inhumanity to man, and I haven't read the whole poem, and it's a Robert Burns poem. That's where that line comes from. And I haven't read that poem in a while, so I don't remember if it's banal or not, to be perfectly honest with you. Mm-hmm. The line can be a beautiful one, but in the way in which it's appropriated often is to illustrate this perfect notion of the Enlightenment, this perfect and increasingly perfectible notion of reason, right, and of artistic appreciation, which often misreads, you know, the again, the equal opportunity insult that, like, Goya's Disasters of War happen to be. And I don't know, it strikes me that maybe you're in Dino's continuous appropriation, because you've done this before with you've done this, you've rectified, and I want to get to this word in a minute, that you guys have used to describe what you do to Goya's Disasters of War prints. But the rectification seems to me also maybe comes out of a sense of outrage from you guys as to what's being done to Goya's original message.
Well, I mean, the rectification comes directly from George Orwell's 1984, which is essentially Winston Smith's job in the Ministry of Truth to, rectify propaganda. I think the point about the Goyas is that I guess it comes from a collision between, an interest in Goya, interest in the notion that he presents this idea, this thing, the sleep of reason engenders monsters. So there's this notion that how we can read the work is as a kind of a warning against the irrationality of violence. Deleuze says something more interesting. He says it's not the sleep of reason that engenders monsters, but vigilant and insomniac rationality. Now, and I think that what you can kind of get from that is the sense in which the violence that Goya offers is a kind of, it would kind of fall within the purview of something that Benjamin would call divine violence, you know, that the subjective pictorial representation of violence in the disaster of war is a representation of divine violence. That means to say that it's a violence that isn't attached to any kind of use value, you know, and that's kind of underpinned by the fact that there's no way of knowing who's being violent to who. And in that sense, what that does is it severs it away from any kind of propagandist use. Now, it's only an institutional demand that that somehow subtracts the violence from the totality of the disaster of war and finds a moral purpose for it. So it transfers from divine violence, in Benjamin's sense, to systemic violence. So that in a sense, what disasters of war has come to represent inadvertently is a representation of systemic violence, because it's now become a useful function as a memorialization of violence. Now, you know, so what it was, so as a work of art which acts as a kind of a taboo against violence, what it's done is it's co-opted violence actually as a future threat. So, you know, so I guess, you know, in terms of having some kind of person doing some incredible piece of sort of yogic sort of gymnastics in front of an object of violence, is that perhaps what's been done in this case is that the violence is being protected from its systemic recuperation.
That's a mouthful, but it makes me sort of think of an observation I read about and since you brought up Benjamin, the Frankfurt School,
yeah.
And I don't remember who it was that wrote this, but they suggested that Goya had essentially gotten the 200-year jump on the dialectic of enlightenment, which was the great work of the Frankfurt School that essentially talks about the instrumentalization of reason, you know, and how it can lead essentially to the death camps, the Nazi death camps.
Yes, absolutely.
That Goya was already there. He was there 200 years beforehand. I think that's something to consider. Well,
just on that one last point. I mean, I think it's Adorno and Horkheimer, isn't it? It's dialectic.
It is correct.
But,
it is.
And I think the thing about the idea of you know, it sounds kind of sort of counterintuitive, but the idea of defending Goya's violence is to not allow it to be recuperated into use. That's the argument. I think that's Benjamin's argument about systemic violence, is that it becomes a kind of, it percolates into prohibition, and by doing that, it becomes imminently violent itself.
I want to remember this when we get to your recent comments in the Guardian about statues and the toppling of statues. But before we go there, I want to mention, and let's keep this image up, that in 2003, and correct me if I'm wrong, but in 2003 you made the first rectifications of Goya Disasters of War prints, correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And what did you do then?
As far this is suddenly turned into an interrogation.
No, that's not what.
No. I'm kind of like racing the thoughts. What did we do? Where was I? What's my alibi?
Well, you put clown heads. You put clown heads and puppy mouths.
That's what it was.
That's what happens when you make so much work, Jake. No. So you put the clown heads and puppy mouths and scenes of rape and torture and rioting and murder. Exactly. And you titled that suite "Insult to Injury." You guys have a way with titles. I have to say. There were a lot of people who were sort of, as I put it, professionally outraged. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I said that. Yeah.
But and I think you also mentioned in your defense, though I don't think it needed defending, that there was that you mentioned de Kooning's Rauschenberg's Erase de Kooning drawing as a form of sort of rough homage. Now Rauschenberg's de Kooning Erase de Kooning is a famous act of rectification that a young Rauschenberg does. He asks Willem de Kooning for a drawing at some point. De Kooning weirdly gives it to him, and he proceeds to erase it, and that's the actual artwork, right?
Yeah.
So you guys use this as, well, not justification, but as a reference point.
Yeah, I mean, you know, without being rude about Rauschenberg and de Kooning, I think that's a kind of a mutual vanity project in a sense. I don't think it's, you know, that I mean, I mean, the idea of drawing on Goya's, it wasn't, you know, the idea is of committing to the pantomime of you know, the melodrama that actually produces, you know, I guess that well, I mean, what is it? Shilmuth Firestone said, you know, modern art is a retaliation against bourgeois taste, or something to that extent. And I think that the point about why, you know, what is bourgeois taste if it's not something which seeks to be insulted in some ways, you know, if it's not something that doesn't kind of gain its sense of avant-garde tolerance by testing its boundaries and having artists to have their tantrums and their kind of melodramatic kind of, you know, tantrum attacks in order to actually display kind of a great sort of flexibility for ethics and for culture in general. So, you know, with the background in thinking that, with a kind of thinking that somehow it's the job of the artist to test the elasticity of a liberal society, then the idea of drawing in Goya's is just merely the most conservative operation you can possibly do, because all you're doing is that you're offering yourself as a kind of a high-paid state apparatus that simply confers upon a liberal society its own, you know, its own kind of cultural viability. And I think that part of the response to the work, in terms of the melodrama, the idea of being kind of appropriately disgusted or insulted or annoyed, is a kind of it's the participation that's required. It's the audience that fulfill the exchange rate. You know, artist A does something awful, and the audience B responds. So I think that's why, I mean, I think it was professionally, you know, whatever, you know, I think that in a sense that there's a kind of a combination between a kind of the work and the symptom. You know, there's a kind of, you know, the artist as the kind of confessional, you know, the pathological sort of outburst, and the audience as the kind of the analyst in some ways, but he's kind of laughing at the joke.
I'm stealing that testing the elasticity of liberal society line, by the way. So look, so 17 years after you do the clown heads and the puppy faces, yeah, you debut this new suite. But is it finished? I'm assuming it is. I'm assuming it is. Yes. It's finished. Okay. It's not allowed out yet. Right, and because you basically made it between 2019 and 2020, correct? So you were working on these during quarantine. Yes. So what was that like? I mean, quarantine. Did you have more time for yourself? Did you have more time to think? Were there less distractions? Yes. I mean, I'm kind of, you know, I'm very cautious about sort of, you know, suggesting that the quarantine was anything other than, you know, the kind of unpleasant. But, you know, in a sense, the idea of kind of working, you know, there's a kind of quarantine in itself, you know, and I don't mean that sounded romantic in any sense. Artists are professional quarantinists. I mean, you know, this is. Yeah, I mean, they prefer to suffer in silence and then make everyone else pay later. All right. Well, but tell me, in the background. That's my wife, and curators too, eh? Yeah, exactly. No, she's not a curator. She's no. I'm saying curators suffer in silence. And then yes. Well, yeah. That's what she's laughing at. Exactly. Well, she's laughing at the idea that curators suffer in silence. Yeah. But look. Let's just talk about the disasters of yoga for a second. Yeah. I want you to walk us sort of through the implications and even through the inspiration that led you, you know, to find these absurd images and do these sort of new rectifications. Well, you know, I mean, I was trying to explain to someone, you know, my interest in sort of, you know, what I think's funny and what I think's not funny. And there's this kind of really awful English joke, which is, you know, I don't know if it's ever translated or, you know, moved anywhere else around the world. You know, why did the chicken cross the road? And the answer is to get to the other side. It's a child's joke. Yeah. And then there's another version of it. Why did the chicken commit suicide?
to get to the other side, So one's funny and one's not, right? And I think that in some ways, the idea that once you've noticed that, that if you jiggle the letters of Goya around, that you come up with yoga, it's very difficult to not think that that's already, that has a kind of, it has a kind of an efficiency to it. An efficiency beautifully bound up with superficiality, And so, we've kind of had this gag knocking around for years that we, every so often we bring it out, for a certain effect. But there's something quite, there's something quite nice about, the banality of yoga, especially at the time of coronavirus, because actually we've all been kind of somehow reeled back into the domestic situation with various sort of forms of hobbyistic activity in order to avert us, killing each other, and I guess that yoga, I mean, and also there's something kind of, brilliantly, ridiculous about the conflation of Goya and yoga. One being sort of, about, sort of the atrocity, and the other about serenity. You can't fail to see that to think they don't belong together.
You wrote an amazing yoga-inspired text. It's almost a short story, frankly, for the show, and it's up for those who want to read it. Not now because we're talking.
Yeah, sure.
You can look at the images now, but don't start reading Jake's text now. Will you relate your encounter via a laptop screen with a yoga instructor named Adrienne and her dog Benji? I can't help but ask you: Are they real?
They're real.
So you were doing yoga. You were doing yoga via the laptop.
I was watching it. I'm not sure if I was doing it. Yeah, I mean, I've been thinking of doing my own yoga channel on YouTube, but
And now, are you going to do it or not?
I think, because the quarantine, the lockdown measures are easing. I don't think people would be kind of stuck at home looking for something to look at. So I think they'll, I don't have a captive audience anymore. No point.
And where did you find the overlays, the images, this absurd image that we're looking at now, for example?
Yeah. Well, which one? The one on top or the one underneath?
Well, the one underneath, we know where you found it. Actually, let's talk for 2 seconds about the one underneath, because I think it's important. I keep reading and hearing that you guys get these pristine sort of like suites of Goya prints to work on.
We have had first edition ones that we've worked on, but we've also had ones that are moth-eaten and have kind of coffee stains on. So we get a variation depending on we've had to now send anonymous sort of bidders into various auctions
because they don't want to sell.
Well, I think if I walked into a Goya auction, I think it would be it would be ugly. It would be ugly.
Yeah, it could be ugly. So how about the overlay? How about the images you've sort of collaged?
Yeah, so essentially just kind of collecting sort of books on yoga, and there's a plethora of them. And just
I tell you what, I don't know how you source these books, because I think I found Jeffrey Epstein in one of the images. Looking very creepy, some of these figures.
Yeah. Well, it's a lot of research. Right. I've had a lot of time.
But it wasn't, as you have, we all have. But it wasn't just a single book, is where I'm going.
No. Lots and lots of different books. Lots of different books.
Right.
I mean, I have unwittingly become a yoga guru without actually doing yoga.
All right, listen, we're sort of coming up on time to do questions, but before we do that, Don, can we go to let's see, row 3 on the left? I just want us to look at a few more of these images.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think the original, clearly we know what's happening here. There's just bodies being tucked into a hole. And I think the text, and frankly, I think it's worth noting, and I think, Jake, you know this quite well, that the Goya wasn't just an amazing visual artist. He was actually quite a writer. And the sense of irony here, and there are very few visual artists that we can say that about. And the profound irony here is the legend underneath. It's not really the title, but the legend underneath says charity.
Mm.
This would perfectly well be Jake and Dinos Chapman artwork. Let's go to.
It is now.
It is. Yes, it is. Yes, it is. On row 5, on the right. Right.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Jesus, where'd you find that image? I mean, not the original one, the other one. It's just so absurd.
Yeah, I know. I mean, it kind of begs the question: what was on the other side of the page?
Yeah. Yes, it does. Now, the text on this one says "Gracias a la almorza," which in Spanish is thanks to the millet. So essentially, what's happening in the background is it's a soup kitchen during the Peninsular War.
Yeah.
People are starving, so there's just like this gruel that like is being handed out, and people are eating. And well,
but that's the thing is, the confluence of yoga and Goya is one thing, but the idea of these images working so perfectly well with these kind of itinerant audiences who are kind of somehow drawn into the spectacle of someone's rear parts, their genitals and stuff. It's like and I guess that thing, isn't it, is what humor is tragedy plus time. It's the problem with the severity of these images. I mean, the idea of sitting there cutting these things up and sticking them on is like it's like laughing and weeping.
Indeed, squeezing humor out of despair. I mean, that's
absolutely.
Look, I think we're going to get to questions in 2 seconds, but before I do that, you were cited. You virtually wrote the article in The Guardian that appeared last week about statues, about monuments, and at least according to. So I want to talk about that for a minute, but. You were almost quoted because it was a headline saying that the chucking of the statue of slave trader Edward Colston into Bristol Harbor was exciting.
Yeah. I don't know if I said it was exciting. I mean, I had a conversation with my nephew about that, and he said, yeah, it's all well and good chucking Colston in for being a colonialist, a slaver. He said, but what about the docks? So this notion of kind of thinking that the statues become the figurative emblem of crime, it's kind of like lets them off the hook. It lets the institutional history off the hook by citing figures, because they do become literal symbolic objects of rage, legitimately so. But I wrote an essay quite a long time ago called "Insult to Injury" about our works on the Goyas, and I guess that that occurred to me at that point. I mean, I found 2 brilliant quotes. One by David, who'd written a petition to the General Assembly on how to take down monarchic monuments. So in the French Revolution, like a painter like David, revered, was a person who actually applied himself technically to how you would actually kind of take these pedestals down and then rebuild the pedestals with all the shit that was taken down to put your own monuments up. So and even in a sense, with the artist that you showed before, the images of the broken they're completely obliterated monuments taken by ISIS. There's always a sense in which an image is going to be graven to someone. I mean, I think I was thinking the other day, one man's reformation is another woman's defamation. So it's kind of tricky to work out what these symbolic gestures become more than just a kind of a reconciliation with an object and some rage, and whether the institutions, whether we're chasing down the institution far enough. And I think I said about the road sculpture that because it actually exists on the front of the building, you kind of think, well, what about taking the whole building down? What about taking the whole of Oxford University down? I mean, how brave are we going to be about pursuing the origins of this stuff?
You quoted Brecht. What is the robbing of a bank compared to the founding of a bank? what is the removal of roads, what you said, from outside the building compared to the leveling of the entire building. Yeah, there's a way, signs for wonders, right? Or symbols for actual structures.
Yeah.
You know, and that's where we are on both sides of the Atlantic, because as you perfectly well know, we're dealing with exactly the same thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Confederate statues.
Yeah, I mean,
Anything else you want to say before we go to the questions?
Sorry.
Anything else you want to say before we go to the questions?
I'm saying sorry.
Oh, sorry. Well, good. I like that. That's very good. That's very good. You're anticipating a lot of. There you go. Hey, good. All right. Listen. Let's bring on Noel for the questions. She'll kindly sort of funnel them to us.
So I have a couple of questions here.
Right.
One has to do with yoga and violence and the juxtaposition of what you're doing there. Is rectifying the original prints a form of violence? Do these works participate in atrocities, or are they giving witness to them, or both?
Right. Is that the new image or the old image?
Is what?
Yeah, I guess. Are they asking if these images participate in violence, or that last bit you said?
I think.
I didn't really.
Let me repeat it again. Is rectifying the original prints a form of violence?
Ah, okay.
Do these works participate in atrocities, or are they giving witness to them? I think they're referring to actually to your prints, to your work.
Yes. That's a good point. I think they do participate in a certain kind of. I mean, they obliterate the original. So yes, they do participate in a certain violence to the original. I mean, I think that might not be a bad idea to sort of relate that to how drawing on some Hitler watercolors, that the idea of what was necessary to do violence to Hitler pictures was to draw bunny rabbits and rainbows on. You know, the notion of actually what could be violent in a certain kind of context with something like a Hitler print could, and it could be taken as being kind of, absolute sort of, to have Hitler turning in his grave because there was a rainbow drawn over one of his awful pictures of a house. It was enough actually to get KKK and neo-Nazis to send us death threats.
Really?
But these are just 12-year-old kids, I think, probably don't have passports. But,
they're probably 40-year-old men who also don't have passports. But okay,
yeah,
that's
true.
A good question.
True.
We got
True.
we got another one. Noel?
We do. Are there any other artists' work that you've thought about and reworking and improving? Do you feel extra pressure not to make mistakes when working on pre-existing artwork? And do you believe that there are such things as mistakes in art?
Ooh, mistakes in art, yes. I think there's definitely a lot of mistakes in art. There's whole careers of mistakes in art. I'm not going to name names.
I wish you would. I wish you would.
I can write them on a piece of paper. No. Yeah. I mean, I think there's. I think the idea of drawing on Goya's is that you would only be nervous about it if you kind of thought that there was a sort of a discontinuity between the value of the thing and the value of what you're doing. And I don't mean monetarily. I think in terms of its kind of conceptual or aesthetic sort of value. I think you could only do that if you thought you were doing the right thing. I can tell you that when we had the Hitlers, we bought a whole bunch of Hitlers and had them in a crate in the studio for 6 months before we had the guts to take them out, and that was a whole different thing. And this, I mean, you might have heard this. There's an anecdote that's quite funny here. It's worth sort of saying. They were quite horrible things to have in the studio. They were like pulsing with kind of negative lights, like Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom or whatever. Yeah, and one day we said, right, come on, we've got to do this thing. And we kind of worked out that we thought these things deserved some kind of rectification, and we couldn't really work out what exactly it was. And I think that I was working on them and, Dinos was, I think he hadn't kind of decided to kind of settle into the job, and he was over my shoulder going, I've started making these rainbows and all these kind of awful watercolors. They're interesting because in a sense, what you'd expect them to have is some kind of sort of indication of pathology, but in fact they have nothing. They're totally inert. And so I'm kind of drawing these things with watercolor, and I'm pointing the brush, which is what artists do, this thing with a brush, and they point the brush. And so I'm doing this, and Dino said, "Do you think Hitler pointed the brush?" In which case I suddenly thought, transference of DNA. Yeah, it's a nice thought.
Ready for another question?
Yes,
All right.
please.
This one takes us a little bit to a different place.
Okay.
And asking about your appropriation of the Ronald McDonald figure.
Yes.
It has appeared quite often in many of your recent sculptures, and sometimes Ronald McDonald is a crucified kind of Christ figure, and in others he's a kind of triumphant rabble rouser. It's all very Basque-esque, right? So
yeah, I kind of see him as kind of Robespierre's sort of hero of the revolution, in a sense. That the notion "pity is treason" can be applied to poor old Ronald. Because if you think about the advent of fast food, it had an emancipatory dynamic to it. The idea that you could almost sort of almost lay a kind of a first sort of wave feminism at Ronald's door, in terms of the fact that he was liberating people from kitchens, so that you could go to the drive-through, stay in your car, and eat, so there was this sense in which that kind of futuristic modernity had a kind of liberational sort of aspect to it. And then maybe at some point you could see Ronald as being a kind of a hero of progressive enlightenment, that he was full of optimism and bright and kind of, zappy, and people could eat cheap food. It was kind of liberated people from poverty, in terms of the fact that they could eat cheap food. But then little by little, the arc of poor Ronald McDonald's sort of progression is that he suddenly becomes the pariah once people realize that the world is being flattened in order to actually facilitate cows. So it suddenly goes from this kind of children's friend, the friend of industrialization, to this kind of pariah of the end of the world. He becomes responsible for absolutely the ecological sort of destruction of the planet. And so I'm just very interested in this trajectory where he goes from this kind of sort of hero to a kind of like a litigious, mean old clown.
The Hitler of food.
The Hitler of food, yeah. And it's also kind of comes from Victor Hugo, the clown who laughs. This notion that the children who were taken and had their mouths cut, so they had a permanent smile. So there's something quite, I don't know if that answers it, but it's a few clues.
I have one other question if we have time.
I think we do. Let's do another.
And it's pretty simple for us, but not for you. What are you working on next?
I am working on a show called The Unwellness of Wellbeing. And I can't tell you what it is, but it's going to be really, terrific. Yeah, it's going to be okay. Yeah.
Well, look, if for some reason you blank out and you don't produce anything in the next 6 months, you can perfectly well use the Disasters of Yoga, because it fits beautifully. All right, listen, I can't thank you enough for being here. This was just a super entertaining conversation.
Great. Good.
I hope you have a great weekend.
Yeah.
A grand time in Beaufort. I hope this thing begins to open up, and that your folks, that Johnson and Boris Johnson and folks are a bit more responsible than they are here, because it's a bit of a
no, I don't know. Boris Johnson here. Yeah. Well, look, thank you so much for inviting me to this. Really, always, real pleasure, and a great pleasure to talk to you. Really good. Absolutely. Really nice. Really good fun.
Okay. Well, thank you so much again. Margaret, you want to come on, I think, to give us the last words, and then our outro. Thank you everyone for tuning in. And again, we're on the 25th, Thursday of next week, and hope to see you back then. Thank you.
Okay, hello everybody again. Thank you, Jake and Christian, for a lively conversation. It was wonderful to get into the depth of talking about some of the images that you've made as part of the exhibition. This conversation, as well as our opening conversation, will be on our website, on the website for this exhibition. And you can hear a conversation with Narciso Martinez, Basil Kincaid, Christina Lucas, and Spencer Tunick, who were the first 4 artists that Christian introduced. I just wanted to say a word about the art market. I did pose a question that we didn't get to about availability of these images and whether they're can be purchased singly or are they part of a portfolio. But maybe many of our viewers understand that at this moment, the purchase of artwork from artists is a wonderful way to support them. It in no way would the Contemporary Art Museum or Graphic Studio or the Institute take any portion of that. But if anybody's interested in buying work by the artists, and which is going to be more than 50 of them, we would be delighted to introduce collectors to the artists or to the artist galleries. I want to say our next talk is coming up Thursday, June 25th at 6 p.m. And Christian will be talking with William Villalongo and Mark Thomas Gibson. And as Christian mentioned, these artists were part of an exhibition, 2 exhibitions, literally. William Villalongo and Mark Thomas Gibson together did a show called Black Pulp that was so relevant for this moment, that taught us so much about the history of civil rights and African-American communities in the United States. And then we did a show that they titled Woke, a 2-person show, because I like to show these artist curators work, and it made a nice kind of resonance between the 2 shows. I mentioned in my opening remarks that Graphic Studio, the Contemporary Art Museum, and Public Art Program are all part of the Institute for Research in Art. And the synergy between these aspects of the Institute, or these programs within the Institute, allow us to invite artists to work at Graphic Studio and make prints. And both Will Villalongo and Mark Thomas Gibson have made prints at Graphic Studio. So we already have a preliminary relationship with these 2 artists. And I must say, Christian has included a number of artists that we have worked with at Graphic Studio and the Contemporary Art Museum in this show. So thank you all for coming today and participating. We welcome your questions and your engagement with the website. I think it's not to give you a homework assignment, but it would be great if you look and come back, as Christian suggested, to the website often and get to learn more about the artists that are participating. So have a look at the website and the work of William Villalongo and Mark Thomas Gibson in preparation for the conversation coming up on June 25th at 6 p.m. Now we're going to end today with art, and we're going to end with the artwork of Dagoberto Rodriguez. The title of the video is called Popular Geometry. It's just 4 minutes and 52 seconds. And at first, it's really a lot to take, but hang in there till you come to the end and you'll understand a bit about the title and the references to artists like Malevich or Kandinsky even. Dago was part of a very well-known collective, Los Carpinteros, with Marco Castillo. Actually, there were 3 artists at the beginning. Dagoberto and Marco have separated and are each have their solo careers. And this video, Popular Geometry, was produced in 2020. So thank you all for coming, and now enjoy Popular Geometry.